Remember when a coonskin cap and a long rifle called ticklicker meant one thing to nearly every kid in America? For 6 seasons, NBC's Daniel Boone turned the wild frontier into cozy Thursday night entertainment, and audiences fell hard for the rugged hero played by Fess Parker. On camera, it looked like a wholesome slice of colonial history brought to life. Off camera, the real story was stranger, messier, and a lot more tangled than anything that ever made it onto the screen. We are talking about a state legislature that got officially annoyed, a tomahawk toss that became a talk show legend, and a cast member who quietly built a sausage empire between takes. And trust us, you are not ready for what is waiting near the top of this list. So hit that like button, subscribe if you have not already, and let us know your favorite frontier memory in the comments. Now let's get into the countdown with number 15. Number 15, the cap he was never supposed to wear again. Before he ever picked up a rifle as Daniel Boone, Fess Parker had already made history playing another American folk hero for Walt Disney. Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier, turned Parker into an overnight sensation and sparked a nationwide craze for coonskin caps in the mid-1950s, complete with bubblegum cards, comic books, and a #1 hit song that seemed to play everywhere at once. But here is where it gets weird. Disney owned that persona outright, and when Parker later tried to break away from the role that had typecast him for good, the studio would not loan him out for anything different, not even for meatier, dramatic parts he genuinely wanted. So when NBC came calling nearly a decade later with a frontier drama of its own, Parker essentially got to play his old character again under a brand new name. He put the coonskin cap right back on, and the resemblance was not an accident at all. It was practically a wink to the audience, an actor illusion so obvious that even the theme song leaned into it. Turns out, the man millions of children knew as Daniel Boone was really just Davy Crockett wearing a slightly different waistcoat, chasing the same frontier fantasy that Disney had refused to let him leave behind in the first place. Parker himself later admitted that Disney kept casting him in nearly identical roles across films like The Great Locomotive Chase and Old Yeller, and even blocked him from more dramatic parts he genuinely wanted, including a shot at joining the cast of The Searchers. Unable to legally reclaim the character that made him a household name, Parker essentially built an entire second career out of the closest available substitute, and audiences never seemed to notice, or perhaps never cared, that they were watching the same actor relive his own typecasting for 6 more seasons. Number 14, a whole state government got involved. Daniel Boone was never shy about bending history into something more exciting for prime time, but eventually the liberties taken by the writer's room caught up with the show in a big way. The series blended real historical figures with entirely invented storylines, tossed in anachronisms spanning different decades of American history, and generally treated the 18th century frontier like a costume box rather than a serious history book. Sounds harmless, right? Not exactly. The inaccuracies became so persistent and so widespread across multiple seasons that the Kentucky State Legislature, the very body representing the place Boone actually helped settle, formally condemned the show for its historical liberties on the public record. Believe it or not, a network adventure series about a beloved frontiersman had managed to annoy an entire state government enough to prompt an official complaint, something almost no other primetime Western of that era could claim. The producers kept right on filming anyway because ratings mattered far more than accuracy ever did, and the show barreled ahead exactly as fictionalized as before, unbothered by the political grumbling back in Kentucky. One particularly glaring example involved an episode built around the Aaron Burr conspiracy, an event that occurred decades after the Revolutionary War, colliding directly with earlier storylines that had explicitly placed Boone in the middle of that same revolutionary conflict. Timelines simply did not line up from one episode to the next, characters aged inconsistently, and entire wars seemed to overlap depending on whichever plot the writers found most convenient that particular week. Historians revisiting the series later generally agreed that treating it as documentary storytelling was a losing battle from the first episode onward, and that it worked best simply as costume drama borrowing a famous name. Number 13. The cap the real Daniel Boone could not stand. Here is the weird part that ruins the whole aesthetic. The actual Daniel Boone reportedly despised coonskin caps and considered them undignified for a frontiersman of his standing, according to accounts passed down from his own family. Raised in a Quaker household in Pennsylvania, Boone preferred a wide-brimmed hat made of felt or beaver fur, the same practical style worn by his father and the Quaker men around him growing up. That kind of hat protected against sun and rain far better than a floppy strip of raccoon pelt ever could, and it fit the modest, understated personality historians describe him as having. So why does everyone picture him differently? Turns out the coonskin myth traces back to a 19th century actor performing in an early stage production dramatizing Boone's life, who reportedly could not locate a proper beaver hat and improvised with a raccoon skin cap instead for the costume. That improvisation somehow became folklore. Folklore eventually became the default image in books and illustrations, and by the time Fess Parker strapped one on for network television more than a century later, almost nobody thought to ask whether the real man would have been mortified by the whole spectacle. Boone's own son Nathan reportedly confirmed the family's frustration with the myth decades after his father's death, insisting in a recorded historical interview that his father specifically avoided raccoon fur and always favored the plain, practical felt hat instead. That first-hand testimony from Boone's own family did nothing to slow the coonskin cap's march through popular culture, and by the time television producers were casting their leading man, the fictional hat had become far more marketable than the truth ever could have been. Number 12. The frontier giant who was not actually all that tall. The show's opening theme painted Daniel Boone as practically a mountain of a man, larger than life in every conceivable sense, with an eagle eye and an imposing frame that towered over friend and foe alike. But here's where the myth and the measuring tape disagree completely. Historical accounts describe the real Boone as standing around 5 feet 8 inches, which was close to average height for a man of his era, not some towering giant who dwarfed everyone standing near him at Boonesboro. Fess Parker, on the other hand, stood roughly 6 feet 5 inches tall, a full head and shoulders above the actual man he was portraying on screen every single week. That mismatch would come back to haunt the show's credibility constantly, because it was not subtle in the slightest, especially once color cameras made every scene feel even more grand and cinematic. And what makes it even funnier is that this exact same towering, imposing image had already been used once before, for Davy Crockett, meaning television audiences were essentially watching the identical physical exaggeration recycled for a second historical figure within less than a decade. Casting directors of that era clearly believed a towering leading man photographed better on horseback and filled the frame more convincingly during action sequences, regardless of what the historical record actually said about the person being portrayed. So every fistfight, every dramatic silhouette against the sunset, and every tense standoff with a rival trapper was staged around a physique the real Daniel Boone simply never possessed, quietly reinforcing the exact same larger-than-life myth the theme song kept singing about every single week. Fan mail from the era reportedly included letters marveling at Boone's imposing stature, proof the visual trick worked exactly as intended on young viewers with no reason to question the screen. Number 11. A frontier built almost entirely in California. Daniel Boone wanted viewers to believe they were watching untamed Kentucky wilderness every single week, but the production told a very different story behind the scenes of every episode. Much of the series was actually filmed at the Fox Ranch in Malibu Canyon, California, with additional location work done out in Kanab, Utah, hundreds of miles from anything resembling the real Kentucky frontier of the 1700s. That means the rolling hills, dense woods, and rugged canyons standing in for colonial territory were, geographically speaking, nowhere near the actual setting of Boone's documented adventures. And there is another layer to the illusion worth mentioning. The first season aired entirely in black and white, giving early episodes a rougher, more historical feel almost by accident of the production budget. Starting with Season 2, the show switched over to color, instantly making the same California scenery look brighter, warmer, and considerably less like the misty eastern wilderness the writers kept describing in every script. Off-camera, everything was staged from start to finish. On camera, nobody watching at home was ever supposed to notice the difference. That same Malibu backlot territory had already done double and triple duty for countless other westerns of the era, meaning eagle-eyed viewers who watched several different frontier shows back-to-back could occasionally spot the exact same rock formations and tree lines, standing in for entirely different states and centuries, depending on which network was filming that particular week. Production crews became so familiar with those canyons that entire scenes could be shot with almost no scouting required, turning one patch of Southern California into a standing frontier backlot for a generation of westerns. Number 10, the sidekick who vanished after one season. Albert Salmi played Boone's rugged companion Yadkin throughout the very first season, establishing what looked like it would become a long-running frontier partnership for the show's future. But here is the twist nobody saw coming at the time. Salmi left the series after season 1 wrapped, and his character quietly disappeared from the narrative altogether, replaced over time by other companions as the writers reshuffled the supporting cast around Fess Parker's central role. This kind of early exit was not entirely uncommon for adventure series of that era, where actors often moved on to other film and television projects once a show's long-term creative direction became clearer to everyone involved. But it left an odd gap in the show's early mythology that was never really addressed. Viewers who fell in love with the Boone and Yadkin dynamic during those first 29 black and white episodes never got any real explanation for where their favorite frontier duo had gone. The character was simply written out entirely, and the series moved forward as though that particular friendship had never mattered much in the first place. Salmi himself continued working steadily across television for years afterward, turning up as a guest star on numerous other westerns and dramas, which only made his sudden absence from Boonesboro feel stranger in hindsight, since he clearly was not struggling to find work elsewhere. The show never offered viewers so much as a passing line of dialogue explaining where Yadkin had gone, leaving an entire early era of the series feeling like a chapter nobody was allowed to finish. Fans who discovered Daniel Boone through later syndicated reruns often started with the color episodes, meaning many never even encountered Yadkin at all, unaware a different frontier companion had once shared equal billing with Boone. Number 9, a Cherokee scholar in a place his people never actually lived. Ed Ames played Mingo, Boone's loyal Cherokee friend, and gave the character an unusually refined backstory for a rugged frontier drama, portraying him as an educated, articulate presence who felt entirely at home discussing philosophy, just as easily as tracking prey through dense forest. But here is where the historical liberties pile up yet again. The show consistently placed Cherokee characters living in and around Boonesboro in central Kentucky, when in reality, the documented Cherokee homeland during that specific period was centered much farther south, and history records essentially no meaningful Cherokee presence in that exact region of Kentucky. So yeah, one of the show's most beloved and enduring characters was built entirely around a geographic impossibility that writers apparently never bothered researching. Audiences never seemed to mind much, because Ames brought such genuine warmth and dignity to the role that the friendship between Boone and Mingo became one of the emotional cores of the entire series, historical accuracy notwithstanding entirely. Ironically, the same Kentucky legislature that formally objected to the show's general historical liberties never singled out the Mingo storyline specifically, even though the geographic impossibility at its center was arguably one of the most fundamental errors in the entire series, quietly baked into nearly every single episode from the very beginning. Some later scholars examining the series have suggested the Mingo character was less an attempt at genuine historical representation and more a deliberate storytelling device, giving Boone an intellectual sparring partner regardless of whether the geography actually supported the friendship in the first place. Number 8, the tavern keeper with dozens of secret voices hiding underneath. Dallas McKennon played Cincinnatus, the gruff innkeeper of Boonesboro, appearing week after week as a bearded, gravelly-voiced frontier fixture for years on end. But that gruff on-screen presence hid an entirely different career happening simultaneously in recording booths scattered across Hollywood. McKennon was, at various points in his career, the original voice of Tony the Tiger, the high-pitched voice behind the beloved claymation character Gumby, the voice of Principal Weatherby in animated Archie cartoon series, and Buzz Buzzard in the classic Woody Woodpecker shorts. And what makes it even stranger is how completely those animated roles diverged from his weathered, leathery persona on Daniel Boone every single week. Kids watching Saturday morning cartoons and kids watching Thursday night frontier adventures had absolutely no idea they were hearing and seeing the very same performer, shape-shifting effortlessly between an animated clay figure and a grizzled tavern keeper without ever missing a single beat. His resume stretched even further than that, including voice work on Disney classics like Sleeping Beauty, Lady and the Tramp, and Mary Poppins, plus a memorable stint voicing Snap, crackle, and pop for a well-known breakfast cereal brand's television commercials, making Cincinnatus arguably the least famous role belonging to one of the busiest voice actors of his entire generation. Casting directors of the era rarely bothered connecting his gravelly tavern keeper voice to any of those other characters, which meant McKinnon spent years hiding an entire second career in plain sight, right under the noses of the very same audiences tuning into Daniel Boone every week. Okay, we have to take a quick pause because if you are enjoying these behind-the-scenes stories, do us a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let us know in the comments which reveal has surprised you the most so far. All right, let's get back to the countdown with number 7. Number 7, the sidekick secretly building a sausage empire on the side. Jimmy Dean joined the cast as trapper Josh Clements during the later seasons, bringing his country singer charm and easy warmth to the frontier setting alongside Fess Parker. But while cameras rolled on Daniel Boone week after week, Dean was quietly laying the groundwork for something that would ultimately outlast the show itself by decades and decades. In 1969, right around the time he was filming episodes, Dean and his brother founded the Jimmy Dean Meat Company, grinding sausage using family recipes, while his own mother handled the seasoning by hand in those early days. That side venture eventually grew into one of the most recognizable breakfast sausage brands in all of America, long after audiences had stopped watching him play a fur trapper on network television every Thursday. And somehow, the same man who once wandered Boonesboro with a rifle slung over his shoulder would spend decades afterward appearing in commercials with a skillet instead, becoming just as famous nationwide for sausage as he ever was for frontier adventures on horseback. Dean eventually sold the company to Sara Lee Foods in 1984, but he remained its television spokesman for years afterward, meaning generations of viewers who never watched a single episode of Daniel Boone still grew up recognizing his face and voice purely from grocery store commercials, with almost no idea he had ever been a frontiersman on network television at all. It is a strange kind of legacy reversal, where the fictional trapper Josh Clements has been almost entirely forgotten by mainstream culture, while the sausage brand born during the very same production schedule continues sitting on breakfast tables across the country to this day, decades after the last episode ever aired. Number 6, the sidekick who almost launched a Muppet legend. Before he ever set foot in Boonesboro, Jimmy Dean's own earlier variety show gave a young puppeteer named Jim Henson his first real national television exposure, introducing audiences to an early version of the character who would eventually become Rolf the dog. That connection alone would already be a strange footnote in television history, but Dean's post-Boone career took an even more unexpected turn shortly afterward. After leaving the Frontier series behind, he landed a supporting role in the James Bond film Diamonds Are Forever, playing a reclusive billionaire loosely modeled on Howard Hughes, appearing directly alongside Sean Connery in one of the biggest film franchises on the planet. So somehow, one actor's career path ran directly from puppetry pioneers, through 6 seasons of colonial frontier drama, and straight into international espionage cinema, before finally landing him permanently on grocery store shelves as a beloved breakfast fixture. Dean's variety show connection to Henson happened years before the Muppets ever became a household name, meaning almost nobody watching Daniel Boone in the late 1960s would have had any reason to connect their frontier fur trapper with the future creator of some of the most beloved puppet characters in television history, a link that only became obvious decades later once both careers had fully played out. Dean also built a reputation as a popular guest host for several major talk shows during roughly the same period he was filming Daniel Boone, which meant he was regularly juggling frontier scripts, musical performances, and late-night hosting duties, all within the same busy stretch of years. It is the kind of career overlap that would be almost impossible to schedule today. Yet somehow Dean managed to ride into Boonesboro on Thursday and sit behind a talk show desk trading jokes with America's favorite hosts by the following week. Number 5, the football star who broke barriers out on the frontier. Roosevelt Grier, known to most simply as Rosie, joined the cast in 1969 as Gabe Cooper, becoming one of the very few Black Series regulars in a network western during that particular era, at a moment when the civil rights movement was actively reshaping American television in real time. Before stepping onto the Boonesboro set, Grier had already been a dominant defensive lineman for the Los Angeles Rams, playing as part of the famously feared defensive line known as the Fearsome Foursome. But here is where the story gets genuinely heavy rather quickly. Just 1 year before joining Daniel Boone, Greer had been working as a personal bodyguard for Ethel Kennedy on the very night Senator Robert Kennedy was assassinated, and he was among the men who physically restrained the shooter at the chaotic scene that night. That harrowing detail would quietly color how audiences later understood him, a gentle giant on screen who had lived through one of the most traumatic nights in modern American political history just months before joining the cast. Greer's own approach to acting reflected that same gentle disposition off-screen, since he reportedly refused to carry weapons in any of his television roles, including shootouts and violent confrontations written specifically for a frontier western, insisting that writers find other ways to stage his action scenes instead of putting a firearm in his hands. That same personal philosophy of nonviolence would follow him well beyond Daniel Boone, later shaping how other productions wrote around his physical presence entirely, choosing hand-to-hand demonstrations over weapons whenever his larger-than-life frame appeared on screen in any genre. Greer later moved into other pursuits entirely, including a public embrace of needlepoint as a hobby and eventual work in Republican politics, proving there was always far more to the gentle giant than his frontier and football resume suggested. Number 4, when the star ended up suing his own show. Fess Parker's relationship with Daniel Boone did not end on friendly financial terms once the cameras finally stopped rolling for good. According to accounts from those close to him, Parker was eventually forced to take legal action against the producers of the series over profits generated by the show, arguing that he was not receiving anywhere near his fair share of the money the franchise continued earning long after its original network run had ended. Sounds familiar, right? It should, because Parker had already lived through a strikingly similar situation once before with Disney, who reportedly used a contractual loophole to sharply limit how much merchandising revenue he actually collected from the entire Davy Crockett phenomenon years earlier. And no, that repeat experience was not exactly comforting the second time around for an actor who had already been burned once. Parker eventually walked away from acting altogether and turned his attention toward real estate and later winemaking, building a personal fortune that owed far less to Hollywood accounting practices than his long television career ever actually did. He opened a winery in Los Olivos, California, that carried a tiny coonskin cap on its label as a nod to his television past, even though Parker himself reportedly refused every request to actually put the cap back on his own head ever again for photographs or public appearances. It was a quietly pointed gesture from a man who had spent decades feeling shortchanged by 2 different studios over the very same frontier persona, content to let the coonskin cap live on as a label design rather than something he ever had to wear personally again. Friends who brought up the cap during his winemaking years often described him deflecting with dry humor, joking that 6 feet 5 inches was tall enough without raccoon fur on top, before steering talk back to the vineyard he had built himself. Number 3. The tomahawk throw absolutely nobody could ever forget. In 1965, Ed Ames appeared as a guest on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson to demonstrate his tomahawk throwing skills, a fun nod to his frontier warrior character over on Daniel Boone. Carson's staff had set up a life-sized wooden silhouette of a cowboy specifically for the demonstration segment. Ames lined up carefully, took his aim, and hurled the tomahawk directly into the silhouette's crotch, with startling and unmistakable precision. What followed became one of the longest sustained laughs in the entire history of American television, stretching on for what felt like an eternity as the studio audience simply could not stop themselves. Carson, with characteristically impeccable comic timing, held Ames back from retrieving the tomahawk immediately, milking the moment for every last ounce of comedy it was worth on camera. That single unscripted segment ended up outliving the show itself in cultural memory, replayed and celebrated decades later as one of the greatest blooper moments network television ever managed to produce, all because a frontier actor happened to be a little too good at his job that night. Ames and Carson would go on to revisit the moment together on air more than a decade later, reflecting on just how quickly a simple promotional appearance for Daniel Boone had spiraled into arguably the single most replayed clip of Carson's entire 3-decade run hosting late-night television, far outlasting the Frontier series that had inspired it in the first place. Clips of the moment continued circulating for decades on anniversary specials and blooper compilations, introducing entirely new generations to Ed Ames long after most of them had never seen a single full episode of the Western that originally brought him into Carson's studio that night. Number 2, the song that convinced an entire nation of a lie. The show's theme song described its hero in unmistakably heroic, larger-than-life terms, a towering, eagle-eyed frontiersman forever synonymous with a coonskin cap, and that catchy tune ended up doing more to shape the public's mental image of Daniel Boone than any history book ever managed across 2 centuries combined. Written by Vera Mattson and Lionel Newman, the melody became so deeply ingrained in American pop culture that entire generations of viewers grew up simply assuming its description was straightforward historical fact. But here is the thing. Nearly every detail baked into that catchy theme directly contradicted the actual historical record, from Boone's real height all the way down to the specific hat he supposedly wore into battle. And what makes it even stranger is just how effective that musical branding ultimately turned out to be over time. Decades after the show finally ended, historians and museum educators still find themselves gently correcting visitors who insist Boone definitely wore a coonskin cap, purely because a catchy network theme song told them so on Thursday nights throughout their entire childhood. Tourism sites connected to the real Boone have described fielding the exact same coonskin cap question from visitors for generations. A small but telling sign of just how thoroughly one piece of network music managed to overwrite 2 centuries of documented history in the popular imagination, one Thursday evening broadcast at a time. Museum educators say the correction rarely lands the way they hope, since most guests simply assume the television version must be closer to reality than whatever a placard on a wall is telling them. A strange kind of celebrity outranking scholarship in the public's mind. Even Boone family descendants have occasionally weighed in publicly, gently reminding interviewers that the ballad everyone hums was written for ratings, not accuracy, and that their ancestor would likely have found the coonskin spectacle rather baffling. Number 1, a fictional frontier stretched impossibly across 6 long seasons. Here is the biggest twist of the entire countdown. The real Daniel Boone's most famous chapter, founding and defending the settlement of Boonesboro, actually unfolded over a relatively short and turbulent stretch of years before he was captured by British-aligned forces, managed to escape captivity, warned the settlement of an impending attack, and ultimately left Boonesboro itself for good, never permanently returning to live in that particular settlement again. The television series, on the other hand, stretched that single narrow window of real history across 6 full seasons and 165 episodes, inventing entirely new adventures, relationships, and conflicts that never actually happened anywhere near the documented timeline. And no, that enormous gap was not just a minor creative shortcut taken here and there. It meant the show's entire premise essentially operated as a loosely inspired fantasy, wearing a historical costume, borrowing a legendary name while quietly abandoning almost everything about the actual man's well-documented life. So the beloved frontiersman millions of families welcomed into their living rooms every single week for 6 straight years was, in nearly every meaningful sense, a character invented almost entirely from scratch. Every rescued settler, every tense standoff with British soldiers, every quiet fireside conversation with Mingo, all of it existed only within the writer's imagination, layered on top of a real man's name and reputation simply because that name already carried enough built-in trust and nostalgia to sell advertising every single Thursday night for 6 consecutive years. And there you have it, 15 wild and surprising facts about Daniel Boone. Which one shocked you the most, and which ones did we miss? Drop it in the comments because we always love hearing from you and reading every single reply. And if you want more deep dives into the stars, shows, and stories you grew up watching, make sure to subscribe and stick around for what's coming next. We have got plenty more where this came from.